This week we'll be looking at the history of dating. Typically we do an activity, but again, we'll just do a straight lecture. I'll probably do it in sections because this one's a little bit longer than other ones. So you read an article on the history of dating that looks at the concept of calling, and then it transitions over to dating. If you notice that calling kind of ends around the 1900s, and dating begins to really take off in the 1920s, and talks about how college kids courted each other and so forth, right? Well, this lecture is in between that era, between the calling period and and dating, which is basically that progressive era of the 1900s to about 1920s. So this kind of creates that idea of dating. This is a precursor to dating. So we're going to define this concept called a charity girl. So how did we go from calling to dating? And there needed to be a transition there, and that transition is the charity girl. We're going to look also of how culture is changing in the 1900s to 1920s. So exploring that kind of progressive era. And really dating comes from the working class culture, right? And again, going back to that Coney Island article, it addresses how many of these women didn't have much money to have fun, so they try to go out and have somebody pay for them. So we definitely see a link, and actually the material from this lecture, which comes from an article, was actually also used in the article about the Coney Island, particularly the example about the chump spending so much money on a particular woman. So we do see how this period is a very important period in women's history because culturally things are definitely changing and somewhat improving their lives. So we begin by looking at this particular study where you have progressive women, this kind of bourgeois middle class women who are talking about this new subculture, right? This youth culture, and they're not very happy. When historians write, they have to use these different sources, and in this particular example, these middle class moralists are critiquing um, this youth generation, right? So it's kind of like your parents critiquing you and how you date and all that kind of good stuff. So it tends to be very biased, but there's certain things that we can use from it to help us understand courtship in America in this pivotal period. One thing that we find is that not just women, but Americans in general are actually working less hours. For the first time, we see the implementation of an 8-hour workday, which, if you can remember from one of the previous lectures, people were working 13-hour shifts or 16-hour shifts. They're trying to keep women busy so they wouldn't be doing other bad things. That transforms, right? Working 8 hours gives you a lot of free time. So these women have something that's called leisure time, and they had a little bit of change in their pocket too. Another major shift that we see is that the department store transforms women's lives, because not only as consumers but also as employees, they kind of dictate these rules of fashion, and it gives them a safe place to work, a clean place to work. Women are the ones who are being targeted by the department store. So we do see this kind of elements of citizenship associated with consumerism, right? Since women are the ones who are buying, there's a sense of, well, we're spending the money, we should have a voice. But in this particular example, we see how working class women have these clean jobs, as they would define it back then. It's defined as lower white collar. Today, it's probably more blue collar. But they're not the dirty jobs, right? They're not factory jobs or at sewing industries or something like that. These are, kind of good, clean jobs for many of these first generation women and young American women working in the city. So most of these people, as I noted, are second generation. Their parents might have been Italian or German or whatever. Most of them are born in the United States and grow up with American culture. So this study actually focuses on New York. So what are these young people doing? Well, as we already talked about, Coney Island is a very transformative location, right? And places like Coney Island, piers in Santa Monica and Long Beach and different parts of the United States allow for a youth culture to come together and intermingle. And this is where we left off with that activity. But we do see how just this social space allows a lot of freedom for a young generation. Another place of entertainment, and this was in the Coney Island article too, it's in this article too, as I said, they borrowed a lot from each other. They're going to movies. They're going to vaudevilles. They're going for shows, and they're not just sitting there looking at some show. They're interacting amongst each other. So working class people are interacting amongst each other and making connections. And then lastly, there's a few other things, but lastly, dance halls too, right? Dance halls are definitely a place to mingle, right? You're there to have fun, but also meet the opposite sex, at least at this time. So dance halls become very important. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. One thing that we see, sorry, with women working is that, they're working less hours than they used to, right? They're having that leisure time. But they're still not making enough to support themselves. Many of them pay the rent, whether it's having their own apartment or even paying into the household, right? But having to pay their parents for rent. Money's going towards clothing, towards food. So at the end of the week, they don't have a lot of money left over. Also, when it comes to where some of these people live, when they did live on their own, as the article noted, with calling, a young man will go to a woman's place, right, in the living room, and she'll play piano and have finger foods and things like that. You couldn't really do that in some of these working class communities. I think the article did mention as to how they tried. They would rent out some kind of room from a building and try to have that formal style of calling, but that gets expensive. So that kind of goes out the window at this time. We find that young women, as they're working, though they're not making a lot of money, there is this sense that now that they're contributing to the family household income, that they should have more freedoms. And even though it might not be a lot, it's enough for them to challenge their parental system that's in place. Other changes that we see, the dance halls completely transform the way people interact. So today, I'm sure you all know your dance styles and what you all do in the dance floor. But back then it was a little bit, it was no different. They if you ever go to Vegas, you kind of see this, people handing out flyers, trying to entice you to go into their clubs. Well, back then it was no different. They would have these things called pluggers that, a small little card that talked about the club, and they would have, either pictures or even lyrics, and they would have these very kind of sexual innuendos, right, to titillate the consumer here. And that's supposed to draw in a crowd. So it happens today. You can probably see it downtown Phoenix or Vegas or wherever, and it happened 100 years ago too. You also begin to see dance crazes, new dances that were out of this world, if you will. I'm going to show you a clip. I'm going to add a clip to this lecture, not this particular one, but you'll see it on where it's posted. So you can see some of these dances from the 1900s. They're quite funny, but nevertheless, these dances really have these, again, sexual undertones to them, where there's a lot of pivoting and spinning and contact with each other, which kind of went against middle class sensibility at this time. They were called the tough dances, and they were very exotic, such as the grizzly bear. And the video that I'll show you has a grizzly bear, so next time you're at the club, hopefully you can bust out this move and reinvent it or something. But what you do notice in all these dances is that people are, at least this young generation, they're in contact with each other, they're touching each other, and this, for the moralists of the 1900s, are they're just kind of freaked out with all these type of dances. So again, there's a lot of kind of shaking and shoulder contact and hip contact and things like that, right? And some of these dances have these kind of sexual intercourse moves, if you will, at least by that generation standards. I'm sure if they saw our dances, they would probably pass out. But nevertheless, back then they were no better, right? Young kids do what they do, and engaging in these dances that created this kind of motion. Young women during this period, again, 1900s to 1920s, would often go out and try to pick up men, as the article noted, and as I said earlier, that they use the same quote, trying to pick up a chump, right? Like today, where we have women's, women's night or something like that, at a club where they get in for free. It's no different back then, where they had a special night so women could go into these locations, and obviously that would draw in men, and the men would spend the money on these women. But it's important to note that these women were there to have a good time. You dress to impress, right? You look all nice, and it had nothing to do with looks. It had to do with personality, and can you entertain somebody, basically? And again, it didn't have to be sexual, because these were respectable working class women, and they take some of the tones from prostitutes, some of that fashion of prostitutes, which is why we kind of looked at prostitution, the history of prostitution, but they themselves are not prostitutes. So that it does kind of raise that question: where is this kind of fine line between prostitution and dating? Is there a line, right? And really, that's up for grabs, but that's a typical question that I tend to ask the class. If you remember Hapgood, that guy who left his wife so he can be part of these labor movements, he talks about these young women, and he talks about them in a very positive light. These are young women that will show you a good time. And again, it doesn't have to be sexual, but he enjoyed the company of these young women. Another thing that we see being developed at this time is the cocktail. Beer is in production, but it has that kind of bitter taste. And the cocktail becomes very popular at the turn of the century. If you ever go to bars today, I'm not sure what kind of bars you all go to, but some of the ones that I've been to, they have that kind of Prohibition era, or even further back. And a lot of these drinks are, they're trying to recreate these drinks from the 1900s. Well, there's a reason for that, and that's because this is when the cocktail is essentially created, which allows and encourages women to drink, right? Drink and drink a lot. Many of these women, as I just kind of reiterated, right? Women kind of, again, wear a lot of fake jewelry, elaborate clothing, and they're really there to impress, other people. So again, your physical looks are not that important. What's important is that you know how to have a good time and keep people entertained. And if you're able to do that, men will spend money on you. So we'll stop there, and then I'll continue another lecture in a minute.